The most insane what-if scenarios. The military actually planned Project A119, nuking the moon. In the late 1950s, the United States military had an idea that sounds like the plot of a bad sci-fi movie. What if we blew up the moon with a nuclear bomb? This was a real classified project called Project A119, dreamed up in 1958 at the height of the Cold War. The point was intimidation. The Soviets had shocked the world with Sputnik, the first satellite in space, and America wanted to prove they could do something so big, so dramatic, that no one would ever doubt their power again. And what's more dramatic than a massive flash lighting up the moon, visible from Earth like some cosmic firework? The Air Force brought in a physicist called Leonard Reifel, a researcher at the Armor Research Foundation, along with a small team of scientists to study how this would actually work. Fun fact, one of the team members was a young Carl Sagan, a budding astronomer who would later become the world's most famous stargazer. Together they calculated how a nuclear blast would behave in the moon's weak gravity and airless environment. At first, they considered using a massive hydrogen bomb, but that idea was too heavy to launch. Instead, they scaled it down to a smaller W-25 warhead, still powerful enough to leave a mark. The plan was to send it up on a rocket, crash it onto the moon's surface, and light up the night sky with a blast that could be seen back on Earth. Of course, once the excitement wore off, the problems became obvious. Nuking the moon risked covering it in radioactive fallout, ruining any chance of future exploration. There were also ethical concerns. Do you really want to be the country that literally nukes the moon? And on top of that, scientists and politicians realized something else. Landing a human being on the moon would earn way more prestige than blowing it up. So, Project A119 was quietly shelved. Looking back, it's one of the most over-the-top military plans of the Cold War. It's almost funny, but it also shows how desperate leaders were to flex their power. Honestly, the fact that "let's just nuke the moon" was ever considered tells you everything about how tense and paranoid that era really was. Next up is a plan that wasn't aimed at space at all, but at America's own backyard, Operation Northwoods. Project Habakkuk, the ice ship. During World War II, the British came up with a plan that sounds like a schoolyard dare, but was actually taken very seriously. Build a giant aircraft carrier out of ice. The project was called Project Habakkuk, and the idea was to guard supply ships crossing the Atlantic from German submarines. Out in the middle of the ocean, supply convoys had no planes to protect them, so the British thought an unsinkable ice base could solve the problem. The idea came from Geoffrey Pike, a British inventor known for his wild ideas, and it was backed by Lord Louis Mountbatten, who was in charge of special operations. Their magic ingredient was something called Pickrete, a mix of ice and sawdust. It turned out to be way tougher than normal ice, almost like concrete, and it melted much more slowly. To show it could work, they built a small test version on Patricia Lake in Canada in 1944. The frozen block could be cut with saws, shaped like wood, and even survived tests with explosives. The full-sized ship they imagined was huge, about 600 meters long with walls 40 feet thick. It would carry dozens of planes, have anti-aircraft guns all over it, and sit like a floating airbase right in the middle of the Atlantic. On paper, German submarines would never have been able to sink it, but the problems piled up quickly. The ship would need a massive cooling system just to stop it from melting, and it could only move at about 7 knots, which was slower than the convoys it was meant to protect. At the same time, new long-range planes and smaller escort carriers made the ice ship unnecessary. With steel shortages and bigger priorities, Winston Churchill and Mountbatten eventually canceled it in 1943. Even though it never set sail, Project Habakkuk is still remembered as one of the strangest wartime experiments. And the little prototype is still sunk at the bottom of Patricia Lake today, a frozen reminder of how desperate and creative people can get during war. Next, we're leaving behind frozen ships and moving on to something much scarier, Churchill's secret plan that could have started World War III. Operation Unthinkable, planning for World War III. Right after World War II ended in Europe, Winston Churchill, who was the British Prime Minister, came up with a plan so bold that his own staff nicknamed it Unthinkable. In May 1945, only weeks after the Nazis were defeated, he asked his generals to think about launching a surprise attack on the Soviet Union. The idea was to push Soviet troops out of Eastern Europe, especially Poland, and replace them with Western influence. The plan pictured another giant war breaking out almost immediately after the last one ended. Churchill's generals suggested using 47 divisions, basically massive groups of soldiers, from Britain, the US, Canada, and Poland. They even considered using hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who had just surrendered, now rearmed to fight their former allies. The attack would have tried to punch through Soviet lines near the German city of Dresden and shove them back toward their old borders. But the Soviet Red Army was enormous, around 7 million soldiers at the time. British planners warned that the Allies would be outnumbered and outgunned, and there were big problems. The US had no interest in starting another war right after World War II, and nobody wanted to risk destroying Europe all over again. Even inside Churchill's own staff, people were worried this plan could turn into World War III. Because of all these risks, Operation Unthinkable never left the planning stage. Churchill was voted out of office soon after, and the plan was shelved. Decades later, when the documents were made public, people were stunned to see just how close the Allies came to even considering a fight with the Soviets. Next, we're moving from a plan for World War III to something very different. A project where the military decided to control the weather itself. Operation Northwoods, Terror at Home. In 1962, the U.S. Department of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff came up with a plan to fake terrorist attacks on American soil and then blame Cuba for it. The whole idea was to whip up public anger so that invading Cuba would look justified. This was part of the broader anti-Castro campaign known as Operation Mongoose, cooked up after the embarrassment of the Bay of Pigs invasion, a failed attempt by US-backed exiles to overthrow Castro in 1961. The proposals were wild and chilling. They talked about hijacking civilian airliners, even repainting planes to look like military ones. One idea was to stage the shooting down of a US Air Force jet by Cuban MiGs over international waters. Another was to set off bombs in US cities, target military bases, and make it look like Cuban sabotage. They even floated the idea of sinking refugee boats, or faking an attack on astronaut John Glenn's Mercury mission, which was America's first program to send astronauts into orbit. The goal was to scare Americans into demanding action against Fidel Castro. The plan was pushed forward by General Lyman Lemnitzer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time. He signed off on it in March 1962 and pitched it in meetings with Defense Secretary Robert McNamara and President John F. Kennedy's team. But Kennedy, to his credit, flat out rejected the whole thing. He wanted no part of military-run false flag terror, especially against his own people. After that, the documents were buried deep, many later destroyed or heavily censored. For decades, nobody outside those rooms knew how close this came to being real. It wasn't until 1997, when declassified files were released, that the public learned the truth. And the fallout was huge. People were shocked that US military leaders seriously suggested killing their own citizens just to start a war. Honestly, it makes you question how far governments might go when they feel cornered. Next, let's cool off from this darkness with something that sounds ridiculous but was actually tested: building a warship out of ice. And hey, while we're at it, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the rest of these wild stories. Operation Popeye Making It Rain. During the Vietnam War in the late 1960s, the US military decided to try something that sounds like a supervillain plot: weaponizing the weather. The secret program was called Operation Popeye, and it ran from 1967 to 1972. The idea was simple but strange: make it rain more than usual along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was the main supply route for North Vietnamese troops. The science behind it was called cloud seeding. US planes flew over the region and dropped tiny particles of silver iodide and lead iodide into the clouds. These particles made water droplets stick together and fall as rain. The goal was to turn dirt roads into mud pits, wash out river crossings, and cause landslides that would slow down enemy movement. To keep things secret, the missions were disguised as weather flights and given the code name Motor Pool. The planes used included C-130 Hercules transport aircraft and F-4C Phantom jets, flown out of a base in Thailand. Behind the scenes, the project had support from people like Robert McNamara, the US Secretary of Defense, but the public and even Congress were kept completely in the dark. And it actually kind of worked. Operation Popeye stretched out in the rainy season in some areas by 30 to 45 days. It caused real headaches for North Vietnamese supply lines, but the enemy quickly adapted by fixing roads faster and finding other routes. Plus, the rain wasn't always easy to control, and sometimes hit areas the US didn't mean to flood. When news of Operation Popeye finally came out in the 1970s, people were stunned. It raised big questions about whether weather should ever be used as a weapon. In fact, it remains the only confirmed case of weather warfare in modern history. Today, cloud seeding is mostly used for things like fighting droughts, but this Cold War experiment showed just how far the military was willing to push the limits of science in war. Next up, we'll leave weather control behind and end with something that sounds like a zombie movie, but was written as a real military plan. Conplan 8888, Fighting Zombies. In 2011, some US military officers were told to write up a new training plan. Instead of choosing a real country to fight, they picked the most unexpected enemy possible, zombies. The result was Conplan 8888, a very real document about how to survive a zombie apocalypse. The idea wasn't that generals believed zombies were coming, it was simply a creative way for junior officers at US Strategic Command, or USSTRATCOM, to practice crisis planning without stepping on any political toes. The plan broke down all sorts of zombie scenarios. There were zombies created by viruses, zombies caused by radiation, even space zombies, and magic zombies. It described how the military would protect things like food, water, electricity, and hospitals while fighting back. The steps were laid out in phases. First, shape the battlefield, then try to deter, then seize the initiative, dominate, and finally restore normal government once the zombies were gone. The plan even talked about quarantines, lockdowns, recon missions, and using missiles and airstrikes on zombie-filled areas. It was written seriously, but everyone understood it was fiction. The point was to teach officers how to think through disasters in detail. When the plan was declassified, it caused a stir. News outlets and fans of zombie movies loved it, and people were surprised at how detailed and creative the document was. It showed that even in a totally made-up scenario, the military still applied real planning methods. Honestly, it might be the funniest, but also the most clever what-if scenario the military has ever written. Thanks for sticking around. If you enjoyed this ride through history's strangest what-ifs, make sure to subscribe and join us for the next one.